Okay, let's get started. So, let's think. Where did we leave off? We left off just finishing up Plato setting up his ideal state, his ideal government, his ideal state in the Republic. And we were moving on to his theory about how his state, even if they could set it up, would ultimately decay. So in the Republic, he's trying to set up a state that could, in reality, actually exist. And so he's trying to put forward notions that he thinks people could somewhere actually do one day. So he very much envisions that this state could come into existence, but he thinks even then all good things must come to an end, and so even his state, were it to come into an existence, it too would eventually come to an end and cease to be. Now, he did a rough survey of the type of states, the type of city-states. Remember, every time I say state, I mean city-state, of one city with its particular type of government. So he does a quick survey of the type of city-states he sees around him there in Greece, and he broadly classifies them into four categories. He says if we look at the basic government types in the city-states around us, we see basically four types of governments. We see democracy, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and then tyranny. And we'll briefly go over what each one of these is. So democracy is a constitution like Sparta's where honorable acts, particularly on the battlefield, win political positions. Remember in Sparta that these kids are taken from a young age, at the age of 6, and they're put through these harsh conditions to try and produce a Spartan citizen. And if the boy doesn't get all the way through that process, he's not able to become a citizen and not partake in political life. So it's through your actions, your once perceived as honorable actions, that you're able to participate in political life. Now, who actually does the work and provides the goods and services for the state? Slaves. So the way it was in Sparta is the land, and there were slaves. The majority of the population there is slaves. The slaves work the land. And the way it was pretty much set up is the state owns the slaves and the land, but some piece of land with the slaves on that land are assigned to you as a Spartan citizen. And you are entitled to a portion of what they produce. And it's a dictated portion, so you get however much the state thinks that you need, and then anything the slaves produce after that is pretty much theirs. So if they have a really good year and they produce a ton, you still only get what you get. If they have a really bad year and they only produce a little, you still get what you get. So you get a fixed amount from the land, but that way you're able to dedicate your life to basically being a soldier and being prepared for these difficult acts that are going to be required of you as a soldier. So that's the first type of constitution he talks about, a democracy, where it's honorable acts that win you positions in government, win you positions in political life, honorable acts that get you your citizenship. Next one, he says, he thinks that his government's going to deteriorate through all four of these. So he says our perfect aristocracy, he calls it an aristocracy, but remember it's more of a meritocracy. It's the best rule. It has nothing to do with like old families ruling. He just calls it an aristocracy. So he says his aristocracy will ultimately descend to a democracy, then his democracy will ultimately descend into an oligarchy. So an oligarchy is ruled by the wealthy few. So ruled by the wealthy, only those with a certain amount of wealth have any political voice, and they must maintain the wealth to maintain their political position. So you have to have so much wealth to be considered a citizen in the state to participate in political life. If you don't have that much wealth, you have no say in the government around you. That's an oligarchy. Then democracy, we have great intuition for democracy. Everyone has equal say in everything. In Athens, when they set up the democracy, almost everything was voted on, except for the things that weren't voted on, it was done by lot. So we talked about one of the times that Socrates was in a political position. That's because it was done by law. It was just a big drawing. They pulled Socrates' name out of a hat, and so he's the one that had to hold that position that year. So things were either done by lot in Athens, or it was just put to popular vote. Most votes wins. Democracy. And then finally, tyranny. I think we also have a good intuition for. Brute force rule by a single man, the most unjust of all governments. Here's what Plato classifies as the worst government. So the best government was the aristocracy, second best, third best, fourth best, and worst. That's the way he sees it. Go ahead.
Why did he think that, so did he say that eventually would fall in this order, basically, into tyranny?
Yes.
And why did he think democracy was so low on that scale? Like, democracy democracy is the next worst thing.
We'll get a sense of why he thought that. So we'll go over how he talks about this dissolution. And so we'll get a feel for why he has a low opinion of democracy. But part of the reason Plato has such a low opinion of democracy in general is because he grew up in Athens during its democracy. So if you go back and watch some of our previous lectures, we go over why Plato has this tint towards democracy. But it comes down to in the, what's the name of the wars? The Peloponnesian Wars, Athens pretty much fails in that war due to its own incompetency as a result of their government structure. And then it's the democracy that ends up killing Socrates, even after Socrates proved himself an ally to the democracy. So Plato, every time he's come into contact with this democracy thing, it's just been terrible. So he already had a low opinion of it to begin with, and then we'll go over this deterioration and some of the things that they noted about democracy in each one. And keep in mind, when we talk about democracy, we're not talking about anything close to what we have in America. In America, we have what we call a democratic republic. The closest government form to that in ancient days was what ancient Rome had. It's nothing like this. This is a very fickle type of government where all the masses could vote one way one day and completely opposite way another day, which made the government very unstable. And so if everyone just got angry one day, they might vote to kill some man that a couple days later they realized that was stupid. Why did we do that? So they could act on their passions very easily. So very unstable government. So with that, we'll let you do yours, and then I'll try to cover the same material afterwards and answer any questions.
So Plato's Republic gives us the dialogue of Socrates and his friends as they create their perfect utopia, as good and just as any state could ever hope to be. With the assistance of his companions, Glaucon, Thrasymachus, Adeimantus, and many others, he discovers the true meaning of justice, where it can be found, and whether or not it's better to have than to not. This entire dialogue occurs in 10 books, each with their own parts within, during which he gains another step closer to finding pure justice and what it can do for a man, proving each assumption as he goes along. Is it better for a man to be just and appear unjust, or a man to be unjust and appear just? During his later books, 8, 9, and 10, he shows the aspects of many governments, tyranny in detail, and poetry in the state. Previous to Book 8, Socrates describes the perfectly just state and has deemed it to be ruled by his philosopher kings, or the guardians of the state. He does, however, admit to the fact that it is a human state, and as all things human, it will make mistakes. Gradually, the new guardians may not uphold the old ways like is necessary for a stable republic. They will look towards owning their own lands and properties and become men in search of honor. They will make changes in the government to enable them to obtain these things, and the perfect utopia will fall into democracy. It will be ruled by those who seek honor, mostly by warring means, and will not look to wisdom to guide them, but spirit. Spirit will be the leading prize and be the leader of their state.
Pause for 1 second. We remember his tripartite soul. There was reason, which ruled, then spirit is the passionate element in you, and then there was the appetites, which want gain. So when he's talking about spirit here, he's talking about that spirited element in you, that passionate element in you, the part that he associated courage with. Okay, sorry.
And he also says the same will appear in a democratic individual. He will be an honor-seeking man, a proud man who gains his wealth through war. Over the generations, the leaders may develop a strong desire for money than for their honors, and thus the democracy will degenerate into an oligarchy. The oligarchical state is a state where the rulers are wealthy. Their say in court resides on how much wealth they have been able to obtain. The desires of the state have been directed towards the riches the world has to offer them, so that becomes the mission of the rulers. The state is divided between the poor and the wealthy, since it is off the poor that the rich gain their money. Beggars and poverty-stricken come to being, and they become like drones, never being able to produce for themselves and becoming a leech for the state. The wealthy will not be able to arm the poor in war, since there is contention between them, and the rich are more afraid of the poor than from the outsiders coming to take them. This is an unhealthy and unjust state, and so is the same with the man. The oligarchical man is after the riches of the world. This becomes his desire and his everything. This would be the appetite in the part of the soul. His spirit and reason are limited to that which can make him money, the only thing he desires. This is an unjust man, and eventually the state will become so divided that the poor overthrow the rich and create the next state, a democracy. The democracy is the state in which the poverty has driven out the wealthy. The people dominate the city and hand out the many positions of power with no sense of reason, giving those unfit rule of power. There is no harmony within the state, since it has people where they do not belong, and everybody doing as they feel free to do. Their guiding principle is freedom, and they will follow that ideal before they listen to their reason. So it is with the corresponding individual. They love freedom and even use that as their guiding principle throughout life. They love equality and despise the rich, for they take from the poor. They believe in ideals more than logic and are unjust people. Eventually, in a democratic state, an individual will rise into power over the state, supported by the people, and thus begins the most unjust of all governments, tyranny. Naturally, within the democratic state, there will be a class that will gain wealth. This class threatens the poorer class, and they revolt against those supposed oligarchs. Leading this revolt will be a tyrant who will rise into power through popular opinion and proceed to enslave the state. He kills the good for fear they will reveal who he truly is, and will constantly enter into war so he can distract the people from what he's really doing in the state. He will keep the popular opinion of the poor and uneducated, so he can keep his power without anyone being able to throw them. Book 9 begins with the long insight in the soul of a tyrannical man. This is a man who is completely overcome by lawless desire, an insatiable erotic love, to the point that it becomes the guiding principle in all that he does. He uses deception and force to get what he wants, and it becomes impossible for him to trust or have any real friends. He becomes insane and does anything that is necessary to fulfill his desires, whether it's for money, appetite, fame, erotic loves, or power. He is doomed to live a life of fear, and his decent parts of the soul have become overcome by these more savage parts. While this may seem the most wretched state a soul can be in, the public tyrant has it worse than the private tyrant. A public tyrant is the most unjust that a man can become. His life is constantly in threat from those who will take revenge on the many crimes he has committed. His slaves are abused and hate him. Even his closest associates are always looking for a way to gain some more power over him. He is forced to live in constant fear for all his possessions, his power, his fame, his reputation, and his life. He has the ability to satisfy his unlawful desires and lusts, and since there is no check for him, his soul degrades to become the most wretched of all souls. Because of all this done to him, he is by far the least happy man of all, fulfilling his unlawful desires and never getting what it is that will truly make him happy. The most unjust man is also the most unhappy man, and this proves that being just makes a man happier. In Book 10, Socrates has now answered the main question of the Republic is based upon. He has given his definition of justice, shows how it appears in the state, and shown it to be beneficial. He now turns the dialogue back to a postponed question from when they were creating the utopia. What of the poets? He begins by banishing them from the state. They pretend to know things that, in reality, they really don't know anything about. They cannot know of the gods, and of the truth they pretend to understand. They are only what Socrates calls imitators. They make imitations of the most indecent parts of the soul, and in doing so they pervert the minds of those who listen to them. They appeal to the excitable and base characteristics of a person, since those are what they can show. They can make a man feel base emotions for fictional characters, and in doing so they pervert their own lives. However, he does feel that poetry is not all evil, and looks for its associates to provide them for a defense. Nobody could provide a defense for the poets, so he keeps them banished from the city. The Republic by Plato is an enlightening book for the answers that it provides about justice. It shows how justice can be a benefit for a soul, as well as a person's day-to-day activities. He creates a perfect state in order to answer these questions, and goes into detail about his thinking and reasoning behind his decisions. Made up of 10 books, he tackles all the qualities of types of government and their correlation in the individual, the soul of a tyrannical man, and how it is degrading to him, and addresses the question for poets in the city. As Socrates puts it, our purpose in founding our state was not to promote the happiness of a single class, but so far as possible, of the whole community. Our idea is that we were most likely to find justice in such a community, and so be able to decide the question we were trying to answer.
Great.
There you go.
All right, so we'll just go over the evolution part of what he just talked about, and then after that, if there's any questions in general, we'll do that. Okay, so let's see, did I go to the right side? Well, tyranny, okay, there we summarized them, and now here's next. So, speaking in reference to his ideal state once again. So we start out with his aristocracy, his perfectly set up state. Now, like I said, it's eventually going to decay. So eventually in the state, there will come a point when even the best of the citizens do not qualify to be guardians. So guardians have to go through this 50-year education program to qualify to be a guardian. And he says, eventually there's just going to come a point where the best that we have aren't quite fit to be guardians. What do we do at that point? Do we get rid of the whole state, or do we do the best we can with what we have? It says we're going to have to do the best we can with what we have, and what's the next best thing to the guardians? Those that were qualified to just be soldiers. So he says we're going to have to elevate some of these soldiers, the best of the soldiers that we can find, to the position of guardian. So then the state will be ruled by spirited men who undervalue the musical education and overvalue gymnastics. Remember, these are the two basic forms of education that you get early on in life. The idea being, a man needs to have his musical education so he doesn't become too brutal, but he also needs to have his gymnastic education so he doesn't become too effeminate, trying to balance those two things. So we're going to get this imbalance at the head now with the spirited men who focus more on the gymnastics education and less on the musical education. Now, naturally, the guardians, once they're more spirited men, are going to feel a natural camaraderie, a natural connection with also the soldiers of the state who are also men of the spirited element. So they will unite with the soldiers and take control of the entire state. So these more spirited men, who are more brutal men, they're going to be sitting here at the top of the state running everything and ask themselves a basic question: why do we let them have all the land and control the land? Why do we just let the masses? Look at them, they're pathetic compared to us. We can absolutely destroy them. Why don't we just take what they have? Why do we let them manage it? Why don't we take control? So he says there's going to come a point where that's kind of their thinking and they're going to take the state. So becoming more brutal, they will seize the land and enslave the working class. Now the working class will work the land for them, the rulers of the state. And so in this way, they will then establish a democracy. Only those who prove themselves to be real men are going to be qualified to be citizens in the state and to have a political voice, much like what you see over in Sparta. So the state will focus now on enslaving, or on elevating great warriors as opposed to philosophers to positions of power. Men will, now he says, one of the downsides he sees, and this was even something common recognized with Spartans, is men will begin to cultivate wealth in secret while outwardly appearing to disdain it. So you're expected not to really care for wealth. But he says men eventually, as they start to get this taste for having ownership of some stuff, they're going to start cultivating a little bit more and more in secret and start creating their private little stashes of wealth that they have for themselves. And he says another consequence is that they will not love their laws, but will only fear breaking them. So since these are brutal men ruling the state, they're going to put forth brutal laws. You have to be a man. You start to slack from that in any way, our laws are going to come down on you in a very harsh way, which was also the case in Sparta. If you think way, way back to when we were talking about the Grecian-Persian Wars, when Xerxes was getting ready to invade Greece, he happened to have a Spartan king who was exiled from the city, so an exiled Spartan king with him. And he says to the Spartan king, he says, "Will anyone in Greece dare stand up to me when they see my army?" When he had almost 250,000 army. And the king's reply to him was, "Spartans fear their laws much more than they'll fear your army." So yes, they'll be out there ready to face your army, and they'll fight to the death if that needs be. It's the fear of the laws that keep the Spartans in line. So that's why he throws that tidbit in there. But you've got this cultivation of private wealth in secret. Well, as time goes on, more and more men begin to hoard wealth. It becomes more and more common knowledge. So even though you're hoarding your wealth and outwardly you're saying, yeah, I don't really care for wealth, but you're secretly creating your own stash pile, and so is everyone else, that's eventually going to become common knowledge, and everyone's going to realize this is kind of what's happening. So men then begin to rival each other in the cultivation of their wealth, right? You and me are secretly getting wealth. I find out you have a little bit more than me. I'm going to go out and get a little bit more than you, and then secretly show off. Ha ha ha, I've got more wealth now. It's going to start creating this competition to obtain wealth. So it's going to get to the point where, as they're competing for wealth, men are now willing to sacrifice the cultivation of virtue in exchange for the cultivation of wealth. Obtaining money becomes their top and single priority as they start competing with each other to create the most private possessions. Now, as success is now related to wealth, so too are the wealthy honored and praised. So now if everyone's competing to get the most wealth, whoever does that the best is going to be praised and says, oh, look it, he's got to figure it out. He's doing it better. So it's going to become more and more public knowledge. It's going to come out more and more in the light. people are going to stop sustaining wealth, and more they're going to start praising each other for how much wealth they can accumulate. That's going to start being praised by the state. Once that starts being praised by the state, that's how a state communicates to its citizens what it deems as virtuous. It praises the action. So as that action starts becoming praised, so more people are incentivized to do it, and so that's the way the state goes. And so it is the wealthy who begin to cultivate power. Since they're the ones that praise, they start having influence over other people. And so they establish an oligarchy where only the wealthy are allowed to rule. So he thought that this was a natural way that your democracy would descend into an oligarchy through this competition and hoarding wealth. This state then has a dichotomy between the wealthy few and the poor masses. The poorest will be likely to descend into a criminal class. The more desperate you become, the more risky you're willing to become. One of the things Aristotle points out back in ancient Athens is he says, it's not your citizen soldiers who have great lives that make your bravest soldiers. He says you want someone who's willing to do something just stupid in battle, no matter how dangerous it is. It's these desperate men with terrible lives who are willing to do almost anything for a little bit of money. They have terrible lives, so they're more willing to risk their lives, and they're easier to pay off because only a little bit of money will satisfy them. Whereas people who have great lives are more resilient to risk themselves. So same thing will happen with this poor class. As people become more and more poor, they'll be more likely to take risks, which against the law of which will create a criminal class. And then the reason that one of the processes he goes through is how the rich necessarily create the poor. So a common thing that would happen for a person becoming poor in these city-states would be, so I have moderate wealth, and some situation comes up, some desperate situation where I need a loan of money. And so some rich man offers me a loan of money, but he offers it at a huge interest rate. And so I take the loan of money to deal with the situation that comes up, and then I eat up my whole estate trying to pay off this loan, which I can't pay off because of how much interest it requires of me. So even though I paid him back 10 times what I initially borrowed from him, because of the interest it required, I was never actually to get out of debt. Okay. So he ends up with my whole estate, which is worth way more than what I initially borrowed from him. So this was one way that he says the wealthy would stick their stingers into other people to extract their wealth and become wealthy themselves. And so it creates a poorer class, but it creates a poorer class with a lot of resentment towards those wealthier people. And that's going to be a resentment that goes for probably a couple generations. The reason that we have it so bad, son, is because that guy stole all my money type stuff. And so there's, in a lot of these states where an oligarchy comes to power, there is this bitter rivalry between the masses and the rich, and they're very much seen as opposed to each other and hate each other.
Would you say that this often closely correlates when blacks were freed?
Say that again?
When the blacks were freed in America, they were pushed away from society, and they weren't able to give them jobs, and they had families and people to feed, and so they resulted to this condition of descending into a criminal class to survive. Would you say that has correlation to what you're talking about?
Well, I say that a criminal class comes in general when a person sees that they have little to lose and a lot to gain. So that kind of happens across the board.
Especially when you feel like your government hates you or doesn't care for you, you're way more likely to do that.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I say that's a common psychology. But yeah, he does very much associate. It's when you have a poor class that you also typically get a criminal class in your state. Did I cover the last one? Yeah. Okay. So, things go on. Eventually, men that were once wealthy, typically the sons of men who accumulate great wealth, will lose their wealth through uncontrolled desires and the manipulations of others after their wealth. So another common way he says that people become broke, it's not only when you're moderately wealthy, but you can actually be really wealthy and lose all your money. How does that typically happen? Well, my dad's a really hard worker. He accumulates this great amount of wealth, and he maintains it, and he does all the things that he has to do, and it makes so I can live this life of luxury. Eventually, I inherit all that money from him. I've never maintained that wealth. I don't know what it takes to maintain the wealth, nor do I care. I've always had everything I needed. And so I'm going to just keep spending the money like I've been spending the money without actually rebuilding the wealth in any way. So that's one way that they become broke, and it's also through the manipulations of others. It could be that some young buck at age 18 inherits his dad's estate. Here I am, an older guy knew that he was eventually going to inherit this estate, kept kind of working my way into his life, pretending to be his friend, then getting him to spend all his wealth in some way that really benefits me and just hang him out to dry. Another common scenario. So, a lot of ways that wealth keeps working its way to a rich few and a poor many, with enough time. So then, the poor, well, he says eventually there's going to come a situation, so this goes on for a few generations, eventually there's going to come a situation where it could be a war, and eventually both the poor citizen and the rich citizen have to stand together to fight a war. It could just be festivals where they come together, but he says, as much as you try to avoid it, there's going to come a point where there's this son of a rich man, and it's rich for a couple generations, standing next to the son of a poor man. Now that rich man has, I think the terminology Plato uses is plenty of superfluous flesh and very fair skin. He's never had to work a day in his life. And when he's standing next to a poor guy who's very well built, he's been working his tail off all his life. He's got nice tan because he's been out in the sun, plenty of blisters. His skin's not very sensitive. He can walk in his feet just fine. Doesn't need to be all wrapped in furs every time he goes out. Says when these two come into contact with each other in their daily life, and that poor man looks at that rich boy, and there they are roughly the same age, and he compares himself with him, he'll ask himself, how is this kid in any way superior to me? And yet he gets all this wealth and I don't? What's that going to cause him to think? So he says, the poor and the more physically fit will, when they see how the sons of wealthy men, and see how fat and lazy they are, conclude that men like them are only wealthy because no one has the courage to take it from them. When you see that fat, pathetic little boy, you'll say, the only reason you're rich is because I haven't bothered taking your money yet. But if me and all those people like me gain up on little old you, you don't stand a chance. So the poor will then rise up against the wealthy, overthrow them, and establish a democracy, a state where all are allowed to rule regardless of qualifications. So now everyone is allowed to have a say in everything, and if anyone starts becoming too powerful in the state, the masses can simply take their money, throw them out of the state. Athens had a policy, I think it was annually, where annually they could just vote someone out of the state, and they were exiled from the state for 10 years, and then they could come back after 10 years. And it's something that they used just in case one man was getting too powerful in the state. They just vote him out. Sorry, I know you didn't do anything wrong, but you're too influential. See you in 10 years. Hopefully your fame dies down by then. So they'll overthrow him and they'll establish a democracy. Now typically what they did when they established a democracy was also a mass wealth redistribution program. So when you overthrow the democracy, it's also commonly the case that you strip them of their wealth and spread it to the masses. That's how we have our democracy set up. Now in the democracy, everyone in the state then feels free to do as they please, hardly taking pains to ensure others will do well. There you are walking down the street, you see some druggie, he's pumping himself full of heroin. What do you care? He's free to do what he wants to do, you're free to do what you want to do. What do you care if he's ruining his life? Furthermore, you might not even say that he is ruining his life. They ultimately praise equality for all and claim that no one way of life is superior to another. That's just his way of life. He chooses to make those decisions. Maybe it makes him happier, maybe it doesn't. Who knows? We don't have a better life and a worse life. Our lives are just different. We live different lives. They're equal, but they're different. And you can choose how you want to live, and I can choose how I want to live, and that's all well and good. Democracy. Now, since authority and order are opposed to freedom, those operating with authority will be blamed, and those without will be praised. So those opposed to authority, those against the establishment, those will always be the ones praised. Those operating within the bounds of the establishment, those trying to enforce the laws, they will always be blamed. Both when you're looking at the government, he says this will also happen even in households. Parents, even. So children will eventually view themselves as the equal of their parents, and parents begin to act like children to avoid being viewed as authoritarian. The young will view themselves as the equal of their elders, and the elders will adopt the mannerisms of the young. And here's where you break down the passing on of culture from one generation to the next. It's when it's not the young trying to emulate and follow the practices of the older, but when the older try to follow and emulate the practices of the younger, that's no longer being passed on. So you have adults acting like children and children acting like children. Everyone's acting like children. And he says, even the animals will have some claim to equal and fair treatment in a democracy. It goes so far with everyone needs to be treated equal and fair that we'll even give the animals some rights. And if there's a horse going down the road, what right do you have to say to the horse, get out of my way? I think he says it with a horse. Maybe it was a donkey. I don't know. Something. But even the animals needed to be treated with equal and fair rights. Citizens will become overly sensitive and will become offended at the least touch of authority. Even the laws will eventually lose their sway over individuals, and so the government will ultimately begin a descent into anarchy. So he thought democracy ultimately will end on a descent to anarchy, which is where we can start picking up our tyrant. Unless there's any question about the descent so far. So we've gone from the aristocracy to democracy to oligarchy to democracy. Good? Okay. So now we're on the verge of anarchy. Now he points out that no matter how hard you try in the beginning, I can start a state in the beginning with the democracy, and I can perfectly distribute the wealth. So everyone has the exact same amount of wealth right at the beginning. And it doesn't matter how perfectly you do this, with enough time, some are going to be better and some are going to be worse with their wealth. And naturally, no matter how hard you try, there's going to be a difference in how that wealth is ultimately distributed. So no matter how much wealth is redistributed, there will always be those better at cultivating wealth, and so there's always going to be a wealthy class, even in democracy. You can't get away from it. As the wealthy are despised, remember the democracy typically comes from an oligarchy. We hate those wealthy people. Wealth is often viewed as being associated with some nasty practices. And so if you're wealthy, you must be practicing those nasty practices, and so the wealthy are always despised. So as the wealthy are despised, so are they blamed for the anarchy that's produced. Anytime there's a problem that comes up, it's the wealthy's fault. So now, the masses, as they're starting to ignore the laws, they'll start attacking the wealthy. So the wealthy will be attacked, and now what can they do but defend themselves? When the poor people start attacking the wealthier people are going to have to defend themselves and strike back at the poor people, leading to internal war in the state. Now we're primed for the tyrant. The masses will appoint a protector of the people, one who will defeat the wealthy and reestablish order in the state. The people's protector will at first request a personal bodyguard to help protect him, basically some sort of policing unit, and then will command the loyalty of the masses. In fact, he goes so far as to say there will even be people in this state who will value the life of the tyrant over their own life. That's how much they love this guy. Tyrants at first are wildly popular with the masses. Everyone loves a tyrant. They'll do anything for the tyrant, sometimes risking their own life to preserve the life of the tyrant. So of course he should be able to have a personal bodyguard, a policing unit to protect him in the state. Now realize there's no such thing as police the way we think about it now. That doesn't happen for several hundred years. So a policing unit in the state is very powerful. Once he has defeated the wealthy though, so now he's going to defeat the wealthy. This guy, he's got his personal policing unit. And on top of that, all the masses are aligned with him against those few wealthy people who have done well in the democracy. Those few wealthy people now, they don't stand a chance against an organized attack from all the masses with someone at their head. So once he has defeated the wealthy, he will be free to seize their wealth for himself. And so now look at the position he's in. He's taken all the wealth of the state, or at least a very, very large portion of it for himself. On top of that, he's got his personal policing force, and on top of that, he is loved and adored by the masses in the state. What more would he do than set himself up now as the tyrant, the single ruler of the state? He's got the wealth, he's got the military, and he's got the support of the people. And thus your tyrant is born. So that was his evolution of states.
He had to have probably seen this happen through his history.
Tons of times. So this was happening in Greece. There were tons of city-states overthrowing their governments. Tyrants were a very common thing, left and right. He worked personally with the tyrant of Syracuse. who was a tyrant at Syracuse, and tried to help him a few times and never worked out well. So he also had a low opinion of tyrants.
It's fascinating because you can see earmarks of us being in this very cycle today.
Yeah, you would notice of these, the ones that appeals, the one that relates to us the most is a democracy, because of these, that's what we're the closest to.
But we also resent the wealthy as a people, and we blame them for all these lobbying and problems.
Right, so of all the negative consequences, the ones that we're going to have the most of in our society are the negative consequences associated with the democracy, because if you had to pick one of these, that's what we're closest to.
Yeah, we are very close to it. Surprisingly close.
Well, no, we're still a mile away from what he calls democracy.
I would say that we have a balance of a lot of different things.
We have a ton of balance. So the Romans they did a lot of work to maintain balance of powers and to try and stop any person from becoming too powerful. So our system is way more modeled on the Roman system than it is on the democracy. But it does, of the governments listed here, the one we're by far the closest to is a democracy. Yeah.
But you also see us leading into this very problem here,
Of a tyranny?
where we're blaming the wealth, and
Oh yeah, we have the same blaming, but we don't have the same deterioration.
A tyrant did, and we moved him out 4 years later.
Yeah, lots of time frames. So that's one of the things that came with, well, no, a lot of people had the elected time frames, but that's one thing that the Romans were meticulous about. For example, they would only vote you to a 1-year term, and on top of that, there wasn't one man, there were two. So they had the consuls were the head of the state, and there were two of them to keep each other in check. And one could always veto what the other one tried to do. So, yeah, checks and balances being introduced to the system, that wasn't something that was in these early democracies. It was if the masses want it, they get it. We specifically have in America built into our government system a way of protecting a minority against a majority. And we have a lot of protections that go that way. So we have a lot of checks put in place. Like one of them is the Electoral College. That specifically makes so that the popular vote isn't necessarily the president. And it protects states' rights and tries to keep the power more distributed. So while you see a lot of commonalities in the attitudes of the people, we have a far, far more robust government than a democracy.
yeah, probably because, like I was saying, it makes sense we have a balance. Like, for instance, we might vote a law in or vote an official, but they get to make ultimately the decisions.
Yeah, and people don't make decisions directly.
Yeah,
So
and
we
we
have a
haven't even, like-
republic government where someone represents you.
We even have like principles of communism and stuff with like social security.
Yeah, we do have socialist elements as well.
So it's interesting. But they're not necessarily bad. They're just you put them to where they belong. Just this and that a little bit. Mix and match.
Okay, so that ends what we were going to cover of his politics. And that pretty much ends what we were going to cover of Plato. Any more questions about the politics before we do a quick recap of Plato? Move on. All right, so quick recap. Going through all his major branches once again. Metaphysics. What is Plato's metaphysics? In short, there's this world and the world of forms. The world of forms is reality. That's what the real reality is. And this world is just a reflection of the world of forms somehow. So real reality, the world of forms. Then there's the void, which is nothing. And we're a reflection of the world of forms into the void, which creates this world. So roughly, that's his metaphysics. Real reality, world of forms. His epistemology. How do we come to know things? Well, our soul existed prior to this life, not like, where they experienced all the forms directly. So our souls existed in the world of forms somehow. There they had direct experience with the world of forms, and they were all-knowing. They knew everything. Then we come to this world. And we see images of the form here, right? I see dog, I see dog, I see dog, and it triggers a recollection in my head. Oh yes, dogness. Now I remember. So after seeing a few dogs, I can start identifying a bunch of new dogs as well as dogs. So we see images of the form here, which causes us to recollect the form. All knowledge is about the form, not about particular things that we see around us. I can't really learn anything about this world. When it comes to this world, we can have opinion at best. all knowledge, all true knowledge is about the world of forms. Everything we learn about is a world of forms. All knowledge is based on universals. For every universal, there's a form. So all knowledge is knowledge about the world of forms. Make sense? Epistemology. Ethics. So with ethics, the more Platonic elements, kind of ignoring the Socrates part of it. The soul is composed of three parts: logos, thymos, and eros. The four chief virtues, well, maybe remind us in case we don't remember. Logos, the reasoning part of you. Thymos, the passionate part of you. Eros, the appetitive part of you. The four chief virtues are temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice, and are related to the separate parts of the soul functioning correctly, right? So when we don't let our desire for pleasure overrule our reason, we want to eat that cake, but our reason says, nope, you've had enough calories today, we hold off, that's temperance. Courage, something might be painful, our reason says do it anyway, that's courage. Wisdom, coming to know the forms, and then justice, all three parts of the soul operating as they ought. That's roughly his ethics. His politics, man is to the state what parts of the body are to the man. He wants the state to basically operate like one individual. He tries to set up, instead of three parts of the soul, he instead sets up three classes of men to operate as those parts. So man is to the state what parts of the body are to the man. The best state functions like a single individual. Very much collectivist type thinking here. And even though he doesn't think that you have to sacrifice the individual for the collective, he said you should sacrifice the individual for the collective, but in practice that never really needs to happen because supporting the collective is supporting the individual. So he never saw conflict there. And then aesthetics, we barely nicked upon it, didn't go very far into this one, but in short, love is the soul's response to beauty. The good is the beautiful. They're one and the same thing. Any questions about any of these before we move on?
One little comment I really appreciated about what he was saying about tyrant, because I spent a lot of time studying Hitler and his inner circle, and it was exactly like how he said, like, Hitler wasn't like a happy person. He was heavily doped up on drugs all the time, constantly being manipulated and controlled, and it was just exactly how he described it. I found it interesting.
Yeah, probably should have made some brief comment about how the Republic ultimately finishes up. So the Republic is basically starting out with this conversation. Is it better to be a just man and be despised by the world as being unjust, or to actually be an unjust man and to be praised as the world as being viewed as just? So which of these lives is better? This is the dichotomy that they set up pretty early on. First they have a brief discussion about justice. Then they set this dichotomy. Then they say, well, we first need to talk about what justice is, and then they come back full circle and say, the unjust man lives a far worse life. And the two don't even compare. So cultivate justice and you'll live a far better life. That's kind of the overarching narrative of the entire Republic. That's his most complete work. So if you like his ideas, reading the Republic will give you a good sense for the majority of Plato's opinions. Anything else? Okay. So that finishes Plato, and now we move on to the greatest mind to ever come out of his academy, Aristotle. Plato, this guy right here. Aristotle's this one right here. Now, I'll briefly talk about this picture. I don't know if we already did, but maybe we could talk about it a little bit. So, talking about this picture one more time, you have Plato here, Aristotle here. Obviously, Plato's the older of the two. You'll notice Plato's got his hand pointing up, one finger pointing up to the world of forms where the one universal exists. That's what real reality is. And the book he's holding here is his Timaeus. His Timaeus is a book where he explains where there's the void, the world of forms, and the world of forms shines into the void, creating this world, which kind of is and kind of isn't. But it's up there, the one true world of forms, that's where it is. And Aristotle's got his hand out and he says, no, sorry master, that's not the way it is. That's not reality. Reality is this. He's pointing his fingers out at a bunch of particulars. Chairness isn't what's real, it's chairs that are real. Chairs are what we care about. Chairs are what we're interested in. We're not interested in the up there and then, we're interested in the here and now. And the book he's holding is his Ethics. If you read his Nicomachean Ethics, one of the first conversations he has in there is, we're not after this ideal, perfect knowledge of the way that everything perfectly should be. He says we've got to deal with real life situations. We can only deal with probabilities. We can only talk about this world as it appears to our senses. So very basic, common sense, down to earth views, where here he's talking about this amazing, perfect world of forms reflecting into the void. So that's the contrast being displayed there. Plato versus Aristotle. So, starting off with Aristotle. Aristotle, considered Plato's greatest student, considered one of the greatest philosophers of all time, if not the greatest philosopher of all time. Now, he did everything. He wrote a ton, wrote roughly 200 treatises, none of which are extant. So if none of them are extant, how on earth do we know about Aristotle, and why is he so famous? Well, what we do have from him are lecture notes, and that's all we have, are just a ton of lecture notes. Now, a lecture note, compared to your treatise, is going to be very, very, very condensed, right? A few lecture notes gives you a lot of material, and all we have are those dense lecture notes, which is one of the reasons that Aristotle is so difficult to read. So all we have are lecture notes. And even then, we have more of Aristotle than we have of Plato. So of Plato, we have his published works where it's a nice, slow conversation. We take on one concept at a time, and we have lots of conversation about it. All we have are dense, terse notes from Aristotle, and even then, we have far more writings of Aristotle than we have of Plato's, if you do the actual word count. How much of Aristotle do we have? We have over 600,000 words of his notes. Now, to give you a little bit of a reference frame, there's roughly 1 million words in the entire Harry Potter series. So take the Harry Potter books 1 through 5, turn that into dense notes. That's what we have from Aristotle. Not his complete works, just his notes.
1 through 5 or 1 through 7?
1 through 5. 1 through 7 would be 1 million words. We only have 600,000 of Aristotle. So take 3/5 a series.
Is this repetitive or is it actually unique concepts?
There's places where it overlaps, but for the majority, it's unique. It's different. It's referencing. He writes on different fields, writing a bunch of text. He basically writes a bunch of textbooks. Each textbook focuses on a certain thing. So while you're reading a biology textbook and a chemistry textbook, they're going to have some overlap on some certain topics, but for the most part, they're distinct subjects.
So this is actually him writing it down, teaching it, or is it him just teaching other people and someone making notes of what he's saying?
There's speculation about whether it was his personal notes or notes of students of his at his lectures. I think the consensus for the most part is I think it was his personal lecture notes that he would use to lecture off of. So he had his actual treatises, which were for the public to actually consume, and then he had his notes that he would use to lecture from. And we think what we have are just his lecture notes. Because we do have, I said none of these are extant, but we do have actually little fragments of some of his stuff. So he did write some dialogues like Plato did, and we do have a couple fragments here and there of those, but with how much we have to cover, we're not even going to bother with those. Okay, so in these 600,000 words of dense notes, what did he write about? Well, his writings cover many subjects including physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology, geology, and government, to name a few. He wrote on basically everything. And then the most impressive part of this list is many of the fields he covered were the first time they were being formally covered. Many of these, he's the first one really starting this field. He's the father of the field, the one initiating the field. And then oftentimes in his works, he also gives a brief summarization of what the philosophers had to say on the subject before him. So you might remember when we were going through like Thales, not Parmenides, but Thales, who's after Thales? And Anaximander, Anaximenes. Was it Anaximander?
Yeah, there's an Anaximander.
Then, Anaxagoras. That's what I was confusing with. And Anaximander, and then Anaximenes. Those guys, way, way back. A lot of our references, a lot of the material we had for them comes from Aristotle and his metaphysics. So most of what the pre-Socratic philosophers talked about was metaphysics. Often Aristotle gives you what the experts prior to him said on the subject before he starts giving his own 2 cents. And so a lot of our understanding of previous philosophers just comes from, for example, his metaphysics, because he wanted to address what they had to say briefly before he gives you his own ideas. His basic notion is that while the wise men before us didn't know everything, they probably knew some things, and we should take from them what we can before we try to push the field forward. Okay, so we said he started some fields. What fields did he start, or what fields is he often considered the father of? Well, he's considered the father of logic, the father of biology, the father of political science, the father of zoology, the father of embryology, the father of natural law, the father of the scientific method, the father of rhetoric, the father of psychology, the father of realism, the father of criticism, the father of individualism, the father of teleology, and the father of meteorology. Go ahead.
What's embryology?
Embryos. So most of his works, the thing he's most fascinated with, if you had to pick one where he expanded the most, it's in the field of biology and subfields there. So actually studying embryos, life as it develops.
What's
Teleology.
teleology?
Teleology is end-oriented thinking. So a teleologist talking about our universe would say that our universe was designed toward some end. It was designed for some function. It's not some freak accident that just happened and now we're here, but it was designed for us to be here. It was designed for a purpose. So almost anyone religious is going to be teleological to some extent. But he applies teleology to almost everything. When we talk about his four causes, you'll completely understand why he says this.
Okay.
Because one of his causes, to give you a brief explanation of it now. So he says, if you want to understand something, you need to know what caused it to be. If you want to understand the Pythagorean theorem, you need to know the causes of that Pythagorean theorem. It's not enough to just state it. If you can't prove it, you don't know it. You need to know the causes that cause it to be. He says, in general, there's four causes when we're looking at an object like this chair in order to completely understand the chair. We need to first know the material cause. What's it made out of? We need to know the efficient cause. Who made it? We need to know the formal cause. What was it made into? What form does it take? A chair. And we need to know the final cause. What purpose was it designed to fulfill? If we know those four causes, then we now understand a thing. That formal cause, or that final cause, the purpose that it was created for, is teleological. We're talking about it in terms of its purpose.
Okay.
But that's something that we'll talk about when we get to physics.
What about individualism?
Individualism. Remember what Plato was right before him. He's a collectivist. He says you start with trying to get the good of the whole, and that will produce the good of you, me, him, her, everyone else. Aristotle is an individualist. He says, no, no, no. A state is designed for to maximize the happiness of the individual, and that will produce the maximum happiness of everyone. But we focus on the individual, not the collective. So one example, private property. Aristotle is a huge supporter of private property. He says, look at how you treat public things. Now look how you treat something that is your own. Huge contrast. When it's yours, you take way better care of it than when it's something public, right? If some of you going to college, give you a more realistic one, you're probably going to get a Pell Grant. A Pell Grant where the government just gives you money to go to college. And you can get a substantial amount of money, like $3,000. So imagine that you get a Pell Grant from the government, gives you $3,000, and you go on your merry way. You probably won't think near as much of it as opposed to me. What if I personally give you $3,000 to go to college? You almost feel nothing for the state when it does it. You say, yeah, it should, of course, and you feel entitled to it. When I do it, when it's from my own private means, same thing happened, you just got $3,000. You feel a lot more gratitude, and you might feel more of a sting to actually do something with that $3,000. So he makes basic common sense observations like this to point out, no, individuals should own things, and it's when they actually own things and exchange things that creates this type of camaraderie. If all of us give money to the state, then we get money back from the state, and you happen to get more than me. So let's say we both give our money to the state, we both get $10,000. If I get back $9,000, you get back $11,000, what do you care? You deserved it. The state decided. That's how it should be. But if we both had $10,000 and I gave you $1,000, now you feel a lot of gratitude, and there's a lot of camaraderie between us now. And that's what helped create these bonds between people and the state. So we're jumping way ahead to politics. But yes, individualism.
Cool.
Okay, so some of the fields, oh, go ahead.
Why is he considered the father of rhetoric instead of like a sophist?
So, yeah, it's kind of funny that he's put here because he personally called Empedocles the father of rhetoric.
Yeah.
The first one to put forth the field. But he gives a complete analysis of the field of rhetoric in a book called The Rhetoric. And he's the first one to do that. So even though he gives Empedocles the credit because he's saying, I'm going to take what Empedocles started with and then build this system out of it. Empedocles never actually did that, Aristotle did. And part of the reason that he's the father of so many of these fields of study is because he also outlines how to create a field of study. So, what he did, you could just pick one little work of his, and that's already incredible, and he just did so much. It's crazy. Did it all. Give you another reference for his influence relative to other great minds in the Western world. Obviously, there's been a lot of great minds out there. Now, there's a series out there called The Great Books of the Western World, or it's typically just referred to as the Great Book Series. And what this book series is trying to do is capture all the great ideas ever put forth in the Western world. Not just in the field of philosophy, it's also including history, so Herodotus has a book in there. It's also including poetry, so Homer's in there, William Shakespeare's in there, Isaac Newton's in there. So it's getting all the great minds that have ever existed in Western civilization. That's what it's trying to do, all the greatest minds. And there's 2 people in that whole series that have 2 books instead of just 1. Many people don't even have a full book. There's a lot put together in a book, but there's only 1 person that has 2 books, or 2 people have 2 books dedicated to him. One of them is Aristotle, and the other one's Thomas Aquinas. To give you a sense for how above and beyond he was, even amongst the greats, in what he contributed to Western thinking. Okay. So Aristotle, outside of mathematics, Aristotle was basically at the forefront of every field of knowledge in his day, creating many of the fields himself. Now you might argue, well, he created logic. Logic is what mathematics is constructed out of, so he indirectly pushed forward mathematics, but not directly. So mathematics is the only field that he didn't directly push forward in his day. Outside of that, pretty much did it all. Now, there is a lot of modern criticism of Aristotle. And it's one of the strangest criticisms out there. What it's rooted in is pretty strange. So Aristotle is resented by a lot of moderns. And one of the reasons why is he was wrong in his science a lot of the time. Strange. So one of the things Aristotle said is, for example, is heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. Now obviously that's true in some cases, but obviously there comes cases where that's not true. So Galileo, 2,000 years later, proves Aristotle wrong. And he has his formulation of what gravity is. And Newton comes along later and proves Galileo wrong. And then Einstein comes along later and proves Newton wrong. So yes, Aristotle did not have all the laws of physics worked out. He was wrong on a lot of things. Shocker, shocker. So why do people hate him for that so much? Well, it's because of this other thing that they hate him too. Not only was he wrong about things, but his system was so complete and so tied together so well and so developed that it was hard to get past what Aristotle said. So by the time Aristotle gets introduced to Christendom, he kind of becomes the default authority on subjects. And so it was really hard for a lot of intellectuals to get past what Aristotle said, because they try to say it's A, and people say, no, Aristotle said B, you're wrong. And so it's that resentment of how well he persisted in our knowledge bases, how long it took to push the field further along than where Aristotle left it, that created all this resentment against him. So there was resentment building up against Aristotle from the beginning, and also the fact that the Catholic Church adopted Aristotelianism through Thomas Aquinas, and people want to view science and religion as a dichotomy between them, and they're opposed to each other. And since Aristotle's now been over here with the church for so long, we have to be opposed to Aristotle if we're going to be men of science, even though Aristotle is the father of science. He's the first one to put forth our foundations of the scientific theory. So there's a lot of resentment against Aristotle, which makes zero sense. They hate him because he was great. That's what it boils down to. He did such a good job. And a lot of the fields he started, even fields that you could be very rigorous in pushing forward, it took a long time to push forward. Like where he leaves logic, there isn't significant improvements to that for well over 2,000 years. So, a lot of hate for him, and it doesn't make sense. They hate him because he was so great and so influential that a lot of people believed him. But he would have been the first to throw out his theory if he knew it was wrong. One of the basic Aristotelian tenets is, if you have a theory and it goes against the facts of reality, you throw away the theory. That's one of the things that drives him nuts with Plato. Plato has his theory, then he looks at the world around him and says, must be an illusion. We'll throw away the facts because my theory is solid. Aristotle says that is so backwards. Theories should conform to the facts. You can't expect the facts to conform to your theory. If they don't, you've got to get rid of the theory. You don't ignore the facts. So, even though he was wrong about a lot of things, because he did almost everything, of course he's going to be wrong about a lot of things, he still did an amazing job. So, the hatred baffles me a little bit, but it's the way it is. Historical fact. Okay, so get into his actual life a little bit and get some of the history of Aristotle. So, born in Stagira actually doesn't show on this map because I was stupid and not paying that close of attention when I put it here, but it's a city up here. The point is, it's up in Macedon. Now, Macedon, relative to the Greeks do not view the Macedonians as real Greeks. They're kind of like the backward relatives of the Greeks. They view them as intellectually inferior to us Greeks. We're the pure Greeks, we're the bright ones. Yeah, you Macedonians are pretty close. You're not quite barbarians, but you're also not quite Greeks. So it's kind of viewed as the wild, wild west of Greece. These are your harsh, brutal men are growing up here. We're the nice, intellectual gentlemen of the ancient world.
Like the cowboys.
Yeah, they're like the cowboys, and these are the intellectuals on the East Coast who have everything all figured out. And it was a harsh society in Macedon. So, for example, the next king was pretty much whoever took control of the kingdom. So, you flat out took control if you want control, and it was a much harsher lifestyle up in Macedonia. Compared to, well, I don't know, because Greece is all over the place. There's good places and bad places. Anyways, so he's born up here in Macedonia, and he's always going to have close connections with the Macedonians. His father, Nicomachus, was physician to the king of Macedon, and acted as his personal physician. So Aristotle, even though he was born in Stagira, he was from an early age very much tied with the royal family in Macedonia. So there were going to be close connections right from the beginning, because his father was a physician to the king. Both parents died by the time that he was 13, so he had to be handed over to a guardian. Don't remember his guardian. But his guardian sent him off to attend the academy in Athens at the age of 17. So when he's 17, he goes to the academy, and there he is, now learning from Plato, along with many people. A lot of people went to the academy. It wasn't just a few people. A lot of people went to the academy. We would have had, I would guess, hundreds of people there. Anyways, after he finished your typical program there at the academy, he stood out enough that they decided to keep him on as someone who actually worked there at the academy, so not just a student, but now someone contributing there at the academy, basically move up to like a teacher at the academy. So stayed on at the academy until Plato's death in 347 BC. Now Aristotle's 37. So spent 20 years at the academy and had 20 years where he would have been relatively close with Plato. A lot closer with Plato than Plato was with Socrates. Knew him decently well. Now, when Plato dies, he passes the academy on to his nephew. So the academy fell to Speusippus, which I can't find the actual historical reference, how people piece this together, but apparently Aristotle really didn't like Speusippus, and so he very much didn't like the fact that the academy was just put under Speusippus. So with Plato dying, that's not what drives Aristotle away. It's when the academy goes to Speusippus that Aristotle pretty much says, I'm out of here. Now, just for future reference, it's not long after Speusippus, a few other people come, but pretty soon the academy falls into skepticism. So just note the irony in that for a second. Remember how Socrates started, completely opposed to these sophists. He's out to demonstrate the good, the true, and the beautiful, that these are objective and absolute. Plato, his greatest student, builds a whole system of philosophy to support that idea, and ultimately his academy collapses into skepticism, aligning itself with the sophists.
What do you mean by skepticism?
The rejection that there is any such thing as objective and absolute truth. Let's see, we'll give you the Gorgias summary. Gorgias would say, there's no reality. Even if there was reality, you can't know it. Even if you could know it, you couldn't communicate to anyone, so no sense even talking about it. There's skepticism. And you can go watch our sophist lectures to get a better view of the skeptics, because the sophists were skeptics. So he leaves the academy at age 37, and where does he go? So he moves to Assos. That's just some city. Can probably point out roughly where it is. It's somewhere up here. So we're back to an Ionian colony now in Asia Minor. So it moves to some city up here, Assos, under the patronage of a tyrant, Hermias. Now Hermias, his life is a little bit interesting. He started out as a slave who won his freedom, who ultimately became a tyrant over one city-state and then conquered this other city-state under his control. So someone who kind of worked his way up in life. He takes on Aristotle as a patronage, so he's basically paying for Aristotle to continue his research. Aristotle ends up marrying the daughter of this tyrant. Her name was Pythias, named after the Pythia, the oracle at Delphi. And he ultimately had a daughter who he gave the same name to, Pythias. Same name as her mother. Sure that wasn't confusing. Well, this tyrant lived a short life, as many tyrants do. Well, his time as a tyrant is relatively short, as it is for any tyrant. So, upon the execution of Hermias by the Persians, he moves to a city on the island of Lesbos, which is right here, so not too far from where they were. He moves there, where he's supposed to have done a lot of his biological research, and I guess that there's a, what do you call them? Just lost the word. Bodies of water where during low tide, or whatever it is, the water's low enough that you can go out there and collect a lot of specimens from the sea. So it was a good place for him to do a lot of biological research, in other words, especially of sea life. So supposedly did a lot of biological research while he was on that island with his wife and his daughter. Now he was then invited by Philip II. So kingship has moved on in Macedonia, and now we're talking about Philip II. Philip II is now the king of Macedon. You've probably heard that name before. We're talking about the father of Alexander the Great. Philip II, the man who ends up conquering Greece. Maybe go back to this map for guys who mentioned that. So Philip II, when he comes and rises to power in Greece, he expands Macedon's power all the way down here, except for blue on blue is not the greatest thing, but this chunk right here, can you see that? That's marked out. That's Sparta. So all the yellow up came under Macedonian rule under Philip II. So not Sparta, but everything else. So he's the one that ends up conquering the Greeks. So that's Philip II we're talking about. I think we're right here. Yeah. So he was invited by Philip II. He has these connections to the royal family in Macedon. To be the head of the Royal Academy of Macedon. So very prestigious position for him. Where he eventually educated Alexander the Great, Ptolemy, and Cassander. Now, after Alexander the Great, do you roughly have a picture of what the Persian Empire looked like in your head? Remember how vast that was? So, throw Greece onto the Persian Empire, and that's kind of the empire Alexander the Great conquers. All of that. Right upon his death, instantly fractures into pieces. So, Cassander here ends up being the ruler of Greece and Macedonia, that little part of it. Ptolemy here, you've probably heard that name too, ends up the ruler of the Egypt and just east of Egypt. So Ptolemy, this is the same Ptolemy who starts the Great Library of Alexandria, that Ptolemy. Ptolemy starts Greek ancestry rule of Egypt. Ptolemy, the great, not sure how many, grandfather of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, before Rome just takes it. So that's that Ptolemy. And Alexander the Great. Now of these, Ptolemy's probably the one that he has the greatest influence on, because Ptolemy, after Aristotle dies, he kind of becomes nil in actual Greece, in proper Greece. But it's in a city in Alexandria, which is down in Egypt, a city built by Alexander the Great, but made great by Ptolemy. where his intellectual heirs are able to start thriving. And so we'll get eventually to Euclid of Alexandria. It's that Alexandria. He's there in Alexandria, the same place that the great library is being built, where this new way of thinking is starting to flourish. So it's Ptolemy that ends up kind of carrying on the Aristotelian way of thinking, even though Aristotle kind of, his actual works die out early on, then they come back later. Anyways, taught those three. Those are three of his most significant students. After teaching them, that teaching post lasts as long as it does. Not sure why exactly it finishes. Maybe he just wanted to go back to Athens, but eventually he does return to Athens in 335 BC, so now he's age 49, and he founds his own school in competition to the academy called the Lyceum. And for reasons that aren't worth getting into, his followers were called the Peripatetics. Okay, not the Lycenes or anything like that. So the Peripatetics were the people who followed Aristotle. Aristotle lectured, supposedly how his schooling went. He would lecture on the difficult subjects in the morning, like logic and metaphysics, and then have it nice and easy topics in the afternoon that he'd lecture on, like ethics and politics. So roughly that's how teaching at the school went. I guess we can get to Peripatetos and Peripatetics real quick. So Peripatetos, or something to that effect, is supposed to be like, no, what was it? Now I lost it. Maybe that was the name of the garden. Something to do with he was always walking around a garden when he lectured, I guess. Something like that. I don't know. Not important, since I forgot it. That's how I know it's important. I remember it. Okay. So there he is in Athens. He sets up his school, the Lyceum, in competition with the academy. While in Athens, his wife dies. Not sure the exact year, but she dies. So he ends up taking up with another woman. Aristotle then has a son by Herpillus. I don't know. Come to think of that, that's probably where we get herpes.
I was going to say, it's not a pretty name.
Not a pretty name now. Might have been fine then. Anyways, so it takes up with this girl, has a son by her. She's from the same city that he ultimately was, Stagira, so who knows, old connections, old relations, or old acquaintances, I don't know. Anyways, ends up taking up with her and they have a son, but a son out of wedlock. So they end up having a son, which he calls Nicomachus, after his father. And so we all know that he has a work called the Nicomachean Ethics. I've heard that that's called that because it was attributed to his father. I also heard it was called that because it was attributed to his son.
I heard it was to his son.
I would guess it's to his son, since a large part of this is like directing you on how to live your life. Seems weird to write a book about how you should live your life and dedicate it to your dad rather than your son. I guess you could say, here's what my dad taught me, and maybe it works. So I don't know. I've heard it both ways. He says son. It's probably the son. Anyways, upon the death of Alexander the Great, so Alexander the Great's a Macedonian. Aristotle is kind of a Macedonian. And so upon the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, a lot of anti-Macedonian sentiment was on the rise in Greek city-states. Remember that these Macedonians were viewed as backwards, and these backwards people just conquered Greece, something that the Persian Empire couldn't pull off, and now these backwards people just kind of march on down, taking no problem. Now we know that why they were able to do it so easily compared to Persians, and that's because of the Peloponnesian Wars. There was all this infighting nonstop, so when Philip comes down, not much resistance. And Philip also improved a lot on military tactics of the Greeks. So he improved on the phalanxes, where he made the soldiers use even longer spears. If you remember the formation of the phalanx, it's basically crammed together, you got a massive shield and a spear, and the idea is you can do a lot of damage to your opponent before they even get close enough to you to start fighting. And then if they do get close enough, you can drop your spear, take a short sword, and start fighting. Well, he improved the phalanx so that he basically doubled the length of the spear. I don't know if it was doubled, but made the spear a lot longer, made it two-handed, and gave you an even smaller shield. So that you can use two hands to navigate the spear rather than trying to bother holding up a massive shield. And that way you can get a lot more spears pointing out, because instead of just the first two lines of people's spears poking out, you can now have like 4 people's lines or 5 people's lines of spears all sticking out. So he improved the phalanx, made it a lot more devastating. And on top of that, the Greeks pretty much only used a phalanx. The Macedonians were also notorious for their cavalry. They had very good cavalry, so with their heavy cavalry and their phalanxes, they kind of militarily, they were just way ahead of everyone else. And so they took the best of the Greeks, combined it with great cavalry units, and it's with that Alexander the Great ultimately able to take the military strategy and conquer Persia. No one was really able to stand up to it, including the Greeks. But upon Alexander the Great's death, it's not like he put all these great systems in place to keep his empire together. He was just out there conquering. He died on campaign. Everything's crumbling into separate little kingdoms. Anti-Macedonian sentiments on the rise in the Greek city-states. Aristotle's very closely connected with these people. He's from Stagira, which is up there near Macedon. So a lot of hatred coming his way as well. And so in 322 BC, finally, Aristotle was denounced for impiety by some great ruler in the state. So now he knows that that's what comes first, right? First you accuse him of being impious. That's the first accusation that comes against the philosophers, and soon they come for your life. So Aristotle knew that that was coming down the pipeline, so he ultimately left Athens saying, quote, "I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy." Obviously making reference to what they did to Socrates, so he's going to do him a favor, not let him sin twice, by not letting them kill him. And he ends up moving to his mother's family estate, so I'm not sure, his mother wouldn't have been alive at this time, she died when he was 13, but just completely different families, so. He ends up going and staying there, leaving pretty much everything behind there in Athens. And turns out he ends up dying within the year anyways of natural causes at the age of 61, passing his school to a student of his, and then requesting to be buried next to his wife. I think his wife was buried in Athens, so I think they let him be buried there. His school, it lasts for a little bit, but it dies out pretty quick. It's not near as influential as the academy. But his ideas and his ways of thinking, that starts catching on, and that gets carried on in the city of Alexandria pretty much once the academy collapses to skepticism. So that's roughly his life. Any questions there?
What is impiety?
Impiety, being impious, not proper religious virtue, not showing proper care to the gods, probably not even believing in the gods. Common accusation was that they were flat out atheists.
So was he atheist?
No.
So why? Okay.
Because if enough people say, yep, you're right, he's a goner.
Yeah. that's true.
Socrates wasn't an atheist. It's one of the things he was killed for. Any other questions before we try giving a brief sketch of what his thought process looks like? Okay, so try and give you a brief outline of all his bodies of knowledge before we dive into any specifics. So, summary of philosophy as seen by Aristotle. Now, he's still following Socrates in the pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. He's a follower of Socrates and Plato in that regard. He absolutely thinks that there's objective and absolute truth, objective and absolute good, objective and absolute beauty. Now, you should probably know, oftentimes we're going to say Aristotle is completely opposed to Plato. He's completely opposed to Plato in this branch off from Socrates. Compared to other thoughts like the Sophists, these two are completely agreed almost. So we're going to draw this dichotomy between Aristotle and Plato, making it seem like this is them, but relative to everyone else, they're like this. So don't get confused there, like these guys are at each other's throats in any way. They're agreed on some of the most crucial points. In other words, that there's objective, absolute good, truth, and beauty, that we can come to know these things, and that we can set up systematic ways of studying these things. They're just going to disagree on what the premises are and how those systems evolve, and what should be focused on. So he's very much following the exact same outline that Plato did. He likes everything Plato's trying to do. He's just saying the way you're doing it is wrong, and he's going to throw Plato's whole system out. So what you're out to do, perfect. How you're actually doing it, sorry, that's not going to work. Garbage. We got to start from scratch.
Maybe you guys probably want to explain this, but I missed it, and I really don't understand why they put beauty as such an environmental pursuit, as it's mostly just a way of feeling that helps us realize something is good or bad, that is often manipulated by genetics perspective. So I'm curious why they add that in there.
The good, the true, and the beautiful.
Yeah, well, like what is it that they feel so special about the feeling of beauty?
Well, they wouldn't call beauty a feeling. Well, you had Plato's notion of it. Every time you feel love, it's because you were in some sense exposed to beauty. We use the word love, but it's like a strong attraction towards that thing. So he would say it's inherently the beauty in there that makes something good. So to give you some more modern contrast, Aristotle would say, or Plato or Socrates, take your pick. They say, go take our School of Athens painting that we just had. Now go take that modern art statue of a urinal. They say one of these is more beautiful than the other. It's not about your opinion. One of them is more beautiful than the other. Just like someone giving out charity and someone stealing money, one of those is more ethical than the other. Just like my proof of the Pythagorean theorem and some toddler's proof of the Pythagorean theorem, one of those is more true than the other. There's objective and absolute standards by which we can measure, and so they are objective and absolute.
That's crazy, because I could actually argue all those statements. Someone might find the art of stealing very beautiful.
Well, I said that was good versus not good. Stealing versus not stealing is dealing with good. A valid proof versus an invalid proof is dealing with truth.
Oh, sorry.
A good painting versus a urinal, one's beautiful, one's not, or one's more beautiful than the other.
I mean, I'm sure that the whole society can't all agree that something is beautiful.
And the whole society can't agree about whether or not the earth is flat. What does all society have to do with anything? We don't care what the masses think. That doesn't make it right.
Yeah, so how
The majority of people have been wrong about the majority of things for the majority of time. So you can't go by popular opinion to determine what is and isn't. You need to come up with your standards, your metrics, and measure based off of that.
How do you measure beauty then, if that's the case?
So one of the things Aristotle would say is we measure beauty by is how well it functions for what it was designed to do. So he would say, go take a pruning hook, go take 2 pruning hooks, make one out of wood that's really rusty and breaks the first time you use it, and one that's nice and sharp and cuts perfect every time. You say that one is more beautiful than the other one. It serves its function better.
So that is the definition of beauty, something that serves its function better.
It's a piece of it. We'll have to get to that when we get to his poetics. But yes, that's part of it.
Interesting.
So yes, wholeheartedly, there's absolute and true good, there's absolute and truth beauty, or there's absolute and objective good, truth, and beauty. And we have also an inherent sense of this. Another place that he might say it is, I could represent this number, 2, and I could represent this number, or represent the same thing in a way more convoluted way. We'd say that this one's more beautiful than this one. It's more elegant. In our science all the time, we're looking for the more elegant equations. Is there something objective going on there? How do we decide that one equation is more elegant than another? You program. We say that this solution is elegant, this one creates a big mess. They both do the job, but we still have metrics for saying that one is still, in some sense, superior to the other.
Yeah,
it's not because it's more true. It's not because it's more moral.
Right.
So your final thing to fall back on is it's more beautiful. So that gives you
because
intuition for what
it works
Aristotle
better.
thinks.
So the math is more simple, therefore it's easier to use, just like a more effective sickle or whatever.
Perfect.
And so now for instance, I remember driving across State Rock Bridge, and I remember seeing that bridge from the angle and saying, wow, that's a beautiful bridge. And it was pure, and I don't know why it was, but it looked like it was structurally sound. It just looked like it. I don't know anything about engineering. And to me, I was thinking, why is that beautiful to me? Look at the architecture. And it's probably because it's sturdy.
In your judgment, it was done well.
But what I'm saying is it's purely instinctual. It was not that I knew that it was structured, it was just instinctual.
Well, you have a lot of intuition for how the universe around you works just by operating in it. So just because you can't make explicit how that is, a lot of the times you just have an intuitive understanding by functioning in the universe about how things should work. You might not know general relativity. You know what's going to happen if I drop this marker. If I sit here and ask you, why did it fall? I might stump you. But you have intuition for it falls. So you have basic intuition for the way the universe works, just your basic experience operating in the universe. So that gives you a lot more insight than you might not be able to make explicit. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of that comes into play there. And then basic things like symmetry and other things we did for you. Oh, did we finish everything on here? No, we didn't even start. Okay. So, how roughly then, with the good, the true, and the beautiful, that's a good thing to keep in mind when we draw this framework for how Aristotle sees knowledge. So roughly he sees it like this. So here we have the organon. Now this is his work on logic. It's more than just logic. This is his science of science. This is how we do science. So this is a science of science. How do we do science? I'm calling it science. How do we develop systematic bodies of knowledge? This is the study of how we develop systematic bodies of knowledge. Before we can start talking about individual systematic bodies of knowledge, we need to talk about how you create systematic bodies of knowledge. And logic is a large part of that, so his organon is where all his work on logic is developed. But he's talking about more than just logic here. He's talking about logic, he's talking about basic facts of the universe, and he's talking about language as well, because ultimately what we're doing is we're communicating about things. So this is about language, logic, and basic facts of the universe, the organon. This doesn't fall into any of those categories for him. This is just, I'm going to call it the science of science. Okay, so we have the organon. That involves all this. Okay. Now, inside of here, we have what we would call theoretical philosophy. We'll just put PH there. Going to take up too much space. We have theoretical philosophy. We have practical philosophy. And then we have productive philosophy. A lot of P's. Sorry, hopefully you can understand what I'm writing here. I just need to put boxes and have it build down. Okay, so let's talk about each of these roughly. Theoretical philosophy. Theoretical philosophy is interested in discovering the things that are true. So this is interested in the true. Here we're focused on what is true. In practical philosophy, he says, this isn't about telling people how they should live. This is actually trying to get people to commit action. So this is, in practical philosophy, we're going to talk about things like ethics and politics. Now, Aristotle's of the position, you can listen to lectures on ethics till you're blue in the face. That doesn't make you a good person. You need to go out and actually develop good habits and perform good actions. That's what makes you a good person. So practical philosophy is concerned with making you good. It's concerned with action. So true, this is what we know. Good, this is what we do. Now, productive philosophy is interested in constructing something, building something. So here we are interested in beauty. And this is what we make. So, if you're a craftsman, you're operating in the sphere of making. If you're, well, a lot of actions fall under doing. Some ethical action, right? You're not unethical because you cobbled a shoe more poorly than some expert. That's not something, that doesn't have to do with ethics. It has to do with how well you produce something. You're deciding, well, I gotta pay my taxes, how much am I gonna pay? Maybe they won't notice if I don't report this income here. That's something ethical. And the knowing, that's just knowing. I think that's most intuitive of the three. So he roughly divides it up like this. Your theoretical philosophies, your practical philosophies, and then your productive philosophies. Now, under the theoretical philosophies, he says, first we have metaphysics. Metaphysics, the study of being qua being is the way he typically says it. The study of being in and of itself, the study of being as such. And then we have math. And then we have natural philosophy. And natural philosophy is where we study physics, biology, all the things you associate with basically science today. So that's breaking up your theoretical fields. Our practical fields, this one's a lot easier. We have ethics, and then we have politics. That fall under there. That's fine. You might have noticed earlier they also talked about government. He also wrote some treatises on different governments at the time, but I'm just putting that under politics. That's basically the same thing. And then, under productive philosophy, his major works were poetics and then rhetoric. Now, poetics was a broader term than just poetry. It was more general than that, making things well. So that's a more broad book than what you would think he's talking about. Although poetry is one of the things that you can start. So he does actually talk about poetry in there, but it's definitely not a book just about poetry. So the name's misleading on that one. So this is roughly his way that he views everything. Now notice organon is in everything because you have to logic and reason in every field of study. You can't ignore logic when you're developing rhetoric or when you're developing metaphysics or when you're developing ethics. So the organon applies to everything, and then you can split it down into these separate fields. That's roughly the way he sees it. Any questions on that overall hierarchy?
What does rhetoric mean?
Rhetoric, speaking well, being persuasive. Debate is rhetoric.
And poetics is like, could be art or music, right?
Yes, art, if we give it a more it's broad definition that you used to have, art as in artifacts, as in artificial, as in man-made, not natural. Sorry. Art as in artifacts, as in man-made, as in not natural, not produced in nature. It
So
requires
like a
man to
painting?
produce.
Like a painting?
Painting, but also a chair, a house, is an artifact. A house does not just show up in nature.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so
What about, like,
a little bit more broad.
Yeah.
Anything that absolutely requires man, an act of man, to produce is art.
Okay.
It's just
Cool.
historically that we've narrowed down that term to just mean what we now think of when we say art.
Why does he separate rhetoric from poetics?
Rhetoric from poetics.
Rhetoric.
Rhetoric he's focused on, how can I say this? As modes of convincing people were developing through the ages, there was rhetoric which was focused on just getting people to agree with you. And then there was what they called dialectic, which was trying to get people to see the truth. So there was trying to convince them versus trying to get them to see the truth. So rhetoric has always been a major field in how it's been developing. And rhetoric has been used, in particularly by the sophists. So he's drastically opposed to the sophists. The sophists are great rhetoricians. They're great at trying to get you to agree with him rather than getting you,
See the truth.
rather than trying to teach you anything. They're just oftentimes trying to bamboozle their opponents. So one of the examples he gives of something the sophists like to do, story he gave is a sophist is talking to some simple man, and he says something to the effect of, talking to the man has a dog, and the man's dog just had puppies. So he's talking to the man and he says, "That's your dog?" The man says, "Yes." "And the dog has puppies?" "Yes." "And the dog's the father of those puppies?" The man says, "Yeah, I saw him mate with the mom. He's definitely the father of the puppies." So the dog is yours, and it's a father. Ergo, it's your father. And the pups are your brothers and sisters. Sophistical argument. That's the type of thing that you might see taught in a rhetoric course. How to bamboozle or confuse your opponent rather than winning with the actual argument.
And so he was always in favor of this sharing of truth and letting people kind of make their own decisions with that.
Yeah, he's very much a teacher, teach you everything, but also teach you the art of rhetoric. It's a useful art, just like many other things.
Yes.
It's good to know how to convince people that you're right, and so let's study how to do that. But he wouldn't use sophistical arguments to necessarily do that.
Does he formally get into dialectic too?
Yes, he handles dialectic. So dialectic for him is almost the same as deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is you take a hypothetical premise and you determine its logical implications, right? If all men are mortal and if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. The way he sees dialectic is the person talking has to give you one of two hypotheticals to accept. You either have to accept one hypothetical or its counterpart. Once you pick one, then we explore the argument more, making you do that over and over again. So one is just deductively reasoning with the single opponent as they're picking the premises that you're going to operate on. Whereas deductive reasoning, which he's going to be the first one to develop for the first time as its own formal field of study, he says, no, we're just going to start with the basic premises and develop it from there. So he's saying you don't need, he can't use dialectic in his works to convince you of anything because he can't engage with you. And he's not going to have these hypothetical conversations where they go back and forth, talking about one premise and the other and letting it wish-wash. He's going to start with, no, these are true premises. We're not going to talk hypothetical. Here's your premises. Now let's see what's true. And now anyone can use that. We don't need to have some personal conversation tonight. Anything else? Okay, so there's a rough sketch of his philosophical outline. Let me see what this next thing is. Maybe that would be a good place to start before we jump back into Aristotle. So maybe this is a decent place to end off. In terms of the slides, I'm going to say a little bit more about what I'm going to do. Now, there is so much Aristotle, I cannot come close to consuming all this material and coming up with a presentation to give you guys. That's just crazy. I was able to get through a good amount of Plato, but Aristotle is a completely new beast. And so I have to come up with a way to present this material to you. So first of all, non-expert on Aristotle at all. I probably read like 20% of his works. And then on top of that, as those of you who have read Nicomachean and Ethics know, reading a work once doesn't magically make you just absorb it all, and now you know the material. So I am not an expert on any of the material. I haven't read the majority of the material, and so I'm in no way an expert on Aristotle. And I've got to get what I can and put together presentations trying to present to you his ideas. Now, supposedly, so experts on Aristotle say, if you can get through this one, the Organon, then that's like the key to opening up all of Aristotle. If you can get through this, then you can kind of start working your way around with the other ones. Now, I'm going to try to do basically what I did with Plato, where I tried to give a coherent narrative of his metaphysics, his ethics, everything from Aristotle. But I'm going to first try doing a deep dive into the Organon. So this is probably the only work I'll try doing an actual deep dive into and covering thoroughly. After that, I have no clue what I'm going to do, but I'm going to try and do more summary type stuff than actually talking about a specific work. Maybe when we get back to the ethics, we can talk about specific works, since Nicomachean Ethics is pretty representative. He has 4 treatises on ethics, but Nicomachean Ethics kind of covers it all. So maybe that's the other one that we can really focus on, and politics, I guess. He only has one work called Politics, so that one's easy. But outside of that, the other ones, it's just too much for me to consume. So probably do summaries for those. We'll for sure next time pick up with the Organon. The Organon is where he's going to be developing logic. So if you don't want to feel completely lost, it might be good to go back and watch the very first lecture where we did modern run-through of logic. Because if you have the modern notion of logic already in your head, then Aristotle is just going to present a cruder version of that. And so we have crystal clear, clean logic developed now, much easier to understand than what Aristotle says. He's going to develop a cruder version of what we have now. And so if you know the crystal clear, clean version, understanding the cruder version is a lot easier. Just trying to understand the crude version when you don't understand crystal clear, clean logic is a lot more difficult and can make the work a lot more confusing. Now, I'll try to always reduce it just to modern notation, modern terms to make it as clear as possible, but I can only do so much. So wording is probably going to be a bit dense, and if you went back and watched that first lecture and could understand that first lecture, I think you'd be on great grounds to start understanding the Organon. But I'm also not finished with it, so just fair warning. Okay, so any questions, any concerns, anything else we need to talk about? Okay, so we'll stop there and see you guys next week.